get tested this morning just in case, just, for the sake of my family and that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
should
yeah,
be okay.
yeah,
That should
yeah.
be okay.
Oh, gee, yeah. Well, we all, yeah, obviously hope and pray that. So
Yeah, just feel vulnerable, even though I've had my vaccines, it's just.
and you work at the hospital, right?
I have a family practice, so I have patients in the office that are primary care. I'm a primary care provider, so.
Starting. It usually is, what do we have, 20 people on?
Yep.
Has there been?
Ed, I would expect more people from our party, the county party, to be on. You might want to wait just a couple more minutes, maybe.
Okay. We can have a little discussion too while we're waiting, and then if anybody wishes to frame a question or a comment while we're waiting to start. That's not to put you on the spot about questioning, but.
I would just like to say, Ed, thank you for having these forums, because you started out with Kristen Dumais, and that was an absolutely fascinating forum. And this is a perfect follow-up. And I think that you're addressing a really timely and important topic. And I really appreciate that you're doing this.
Thanks for the comment. I don't know how many on this call know Kristen Dumais, but we had her, what was that, the end of September, talking about the book Jesus and John Wayne.
Yeah, she's fantastic. She's a friend of mine.
Okay, yeah, over in your area of the state too.
Yep.
We're getting people added.
The book is absolutely amazingly well written, and it's just riveting. Anybody that really wants to learn something about this topic, I highly recommend the book.
And we have a number of books that are written by people who are here presenting. And I know at least one of you has a book coming out very soon in May on Daniel Berrigan, I believe, Bill.
Yeah. I was asked in the fall to write an introduction to a new book of his poetry that was to come out. And I printed out and gathered up stuff I'd previously written just to get my juices flowing. And when I looked at it on my desk, it was like, are these the bones of a book? And it was. May will mark it, what would be his 100th birthday. And Cascade Press in Oregon is going to get it out in time. So that's great.
Yeah, looking forward to that.
Looks like most folks are here, Ed. Looks like we're not getting too many new people. If we want to get going.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. And, we really appreciate you coming in out of the warmth and joining us for this evening or shutting off the basketball game. We are so lucky tonight to have four, and they're volunteers to talk about this really important topic, sort of how we respond to these great divisions that exist in our society that are often tied to faith traditions. And our four panelists, I want to let them go, so I don't want to spend time me talking. Our four panelists, I think in the order they've agreed to present, are Bill Wylie-Kellerman. Bill, a lot of you have probably seen our little announcements. Bill is at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Detroit. He's at a lot of other things too. His activities are very long and very interesting, and also the author of a half dozen books. And I believe Andrew Pomerville is going to go second. Reverend Pomerville is the chaplain and director of spiritual life at Alma College. Before coming to Alma, he was the senior pastor at the People's Church in East Lansing, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a multi-denominational congregation across the street, right from Michigan State University, founded recently in 1907. And of course, being the chaplain at Alma College, he has a lot of experience with young people and these issues. Then I believe Reverend Bryan Berghoef, who's the pastor of the Holland United Church of Christ, is going to talk to us about seeking a compassionate curiosity in our faith and politics. Ryan is the author of a couple of works, right, on pub theology. And finally, Julie Thomas-Beckett, who's on with the Meta Peace team in the Lansing area. They're really worldwide, but she lives in the Lansing area and is a nurse practitioner at McLaren Greater Lansing. She is going to talk to us about a method used by Meta, the Peace team, to resolve disputes. So we're going to let them talk to us. And, you know, certainly if you're familiar with the procedures on Zoom, you can add questions. I think we'll shut everyone off right until at least we're done with the presentations, but you can always write a question in chat, and we'll certainly open this to questions at the end. Unless there's a question or something I forgot to cover, I think we're going to turn it over to Reverend Bill Wylie-Kellerman. So, Bill.
Good evening, everyone. So grateful to be here. Am I? Yep. Yeah, I've agreed to begin things. And partly, I think there's a logic to that. I know we're going to hear pastoral, nonviolent approaches to folks who are committed to religious Christian nationalism. But I want to begin with a kind of historical, theological, biblical approach to Christian nationalism, so-called. And I'm going to be categorical and say there's actually no such thing as a Christian nation. Claims to the contrary, it does not exist and is a biblical contradiction, I would say. The constitution of the church as a movement in Pentecost portrays the Spirit acting unencumbered by language, culture, nation, or state, but transcending them all. And the embrace of peoples, indeed of all creation, in beloved community beyond those barriers is really emblematic of New Testament faith and evangelism. And that's not to gainsay local rootedness in earth and creation, in place and community. We're not talking about an abstraction, but to be clear that the allegiance, I would say, of discipleship subverts, obviates, and supersedes every other allegiance. All of that was, just in terms of history, was rendered problematic in the 4th century when the Emperor Constantine claimed to be converted to Christianity. It said he was baptized on his deathbed. But what took place was really a conversion of the church to empire. Before Constantine, there were no Christians in the Roman army. Their refusal to kill made them poor soldiers. But after Constantine, you couldn't be in the Roman army and not be a Christian. And so we're talking not only about the imperialization of Christianity, but the militarization of the church. And theological ethics came to be in the service of empire as well, notably in the development of the just war theory. And what followed was a whole series of national churches. I'm a Methodist, actually. I'm retired from St. Peter's, but in my own tradition, John Wesley said there was no basis for a national church. He regarded it as a mere political institution, although he stayed faithfully as a priest to his death. But as well, we also have historically had a whole series of Christianized empires, really imperialized churches, the British Empire, Spanish Empire, and you could add Portuguese as well. And in those two, evangelism became the front end of imperial expansion into continents, not just in the Roman Catholic, but in Protestant and evangelical approaches to faith. And if you add the Nazi Empire, where the church was almost completely taken over by Nazism, we see the fusion of evangelical Christianity with white supremacy. That can be marked, as a fairly recent fusion, the last 500 years. And that all of that's been a great and sorry confusion of the gospel, which in the US, especially but not exclusively in evangelical witness, has been truly corrupted and preached in many pulpits. And just as Christian nationalism, which fuses, attempts to fuse into what amounts to an idol, an ideology or a theology fusing Christianity, the nation state, nationalism, and white supremacy, has been seized upon and manipulated by imperial leaders from Constantine to the Führer, but also very successfully in recent years in the US as a continued basis for political power. And I would say that the assault on the Capitol was mounted, the beginning of the year was mounted largely by white Christian nationalists. I am for the pastoral and nonviolent approaches about which we're going to hear as we proceed in the conversation. But I'll say that I find apart from recourse to the Bible, I suppose that's the common ground for conversation. But white Christian nationalism is so embedded in idolatry that, and the delusions of idolatry, that I think a conversation is very difficult. So I'll stop there.
Am I taking over then, Ed? Great. Thank you all, and thank you especially for the invitation. I know a lot of the faces and names here on this list. It is a pleasure to be with you. I am going to laugh, Bill, as you talk about the no place for the national church. I served the national church in Scotland, and literally my first example was all about my experience there. And now I feel like this is going to land flat. So let's just, let's see where it all goes. And I'm going to try to be as honest and authentic as I can. I'm coming from it from a different perspective. I think when Ed asked me to speak, I thought it was more about my connection with the students. And so I started thinking about the relationships that I've watched on campus between faith, civic involvement, protest, religion, and my surprise coming to Elma College in 2018 at the lack of passionate religious students involved one way or another. I assumed I was going to see maybe a little bit more leaning one side. And instead, what I have, at least in the chapel where I serve, I'm everyone's chaplain, regardless of a faith perspective or not, whatever their kind of ideology or their ethos might be. I have a very active group of religious students who seem to be largely disengaged, almost apathetic when it comes to speaking out or being even aware of their role or their power that they might have to influence. And then I have a very large group of non-religious students who like me as their chaplain, and they're the ones who want me to find ways to get them to the Capitol, to make sure we contact the right people. And it is two very separate lanes, though. This last week in particular, I had multiple conversations talking about our AAPI students and how we can support them. And I was amazed to hear some of my religious students not understanding what the context was. They said, well, why are we talking about this now? And saying the shooting on Tuesday, and largely going, well, we're really busy. It was amazing, and trying not to be snarky with them as their chaplain, kind of throwing stuff at them like, please be aware of the world around you. But then my non-religious students saying we should hold something in the chapel and we should talk about this, still looking at this central place of some type of, I think, forum or something that they can have as a safe place to talk. My background, though, and I bring this up, I'm only teasing Bill, great points, and I agree with, just about all of them. My own journey from the Presbyterian Church, where I find my ordination, I noticed growing up, and I'm a proud Gen X, so I am just on the cusp of millennial, but I am 1,000,000% not a boomer, and I am not Gen Z. I watched my family and the generation above me very involved and active in seeing the blending of social justice, political activism, and their faith. However, it steered away from faith and more to pure social activism. And my own parents very content, I think, to see their work as an extension of their religion, but we never really talked about the religious foundational assumptions underneath it. And I know I'm making some generalizations, but just in my own life, watching those folks who came out, especially of the boomer and kind of early Gen X, they were acting out of their faith in order to bring about change, or so it seems. But I think the church failed to come along. So we had an awful lot of then holdover of social justice into the, especially late 80s into the 90s, but without the theological assumptions or truths underneath them to ground them. So instead, you're teaching students like me who are growing up in this, being told, go out, speak up, do these things, but we were never told, do it because. It was more of a do it, and the action was powerful. What I watch now with the students is seeing their big brothers, big sisters like me, or their parents who are my age, also having a lack of connection or too much connection, that it's either purely social justice and we are acting and we are passionate about doing, or leave politics out of it. And this whole strange kind of neo-evangelical movement of saying politics don't belong here, just about Jesus, which is very individualized and seems to be taking the politics and warping it and twisting it in a way to make it work for these particular denominations. I was raised in that, but then I did my doctoral work in Scotland, and my transferred my membership and my ordination to the Kirk of Scotland. And in Scotland, while I lived over there, the Kirk is the state. My salary was paid for by the government of the United Kingdom. It was a very strange time to be there as a clergy person preaching during referendum. I was used to the idea of kind of being careful and not being too bold to speak out about how to vote and where to vote and what to do in the midst of that as a clergy person. And over there, my parish in particular, all shepherds who are pretty rural, who were split pretty 50-50 about whether or not they should leave the UK or stay. And they expected me from the pulpit, even though I was a damn Yankee, to stand up and say, here is what we need to be talking about, and we all should let this continue from the sermon and bleed over into the pub later. It was a strange place for me to understand the state's role with the church. And the best example I can ever give that I try to use with my students too, when I've served as a clergy person here, if I have to go to the hospital, I typically go and visit my members or people from my church or connected to, Ed's mom or someone that would be tangentially, but really it's not more than about a step or two away. I told that to some of the folks when I was in Kirriemuir in the Glens part of Scotland, and without me doing a bad Scottish accent, saying, "Yeah, you daft lad. Why wouldn't you visit everyone? Jesus would visit everyone, wouldn't he?" And I remember stopping and thinking, well, yeah, but they're not members of my church. And to them say, yeah, but you're our pastor. You're the pastor to the town, to the heathens and to the sinners and the saints alike. So it doesn't matter if they ever come to your congregation, you're their chaplain, and you should be showing up and holding their hand, even if they're damning God in the midst of it. And it was a fascinating notion to me of mixing the idea of church and state, that there is this long holdover and strange history behind it. Here, I find when I brought that up with a wonderful congregation in East Lansing, of why don't we just go visit everyone and say, we're not paying you to do that. We're paying you to be our pastor in our time. And that type of individualism to me is now what our students have really learned. Faith is about your transactional experience, that you are part of this congregation for you and for them. You're giving them something, even if it's just your presence, your youth, your money, your whatever, and then you are getting certain services back in return. Chaplain to campus, I try to take this idea that I'm supposed to be everybody's chaplain, but the students don't have that understanding. That's a hard shift when it comes time then to talk about things that I deem or believe to be anathema for my own Protestant Reformed tradition in our government. It seems as though the students have been taught, no, you can talk about a personal relationship with Jesus, but we don't want you to talk about what the government's doing wrong. There's not a place for that right now. And I'm struggling just understanding how this whole generation of non-joiners who don't join Rotary, they don't join fraternities like they used to, or sororities, they don't want to be a part of a thing, and they certainly don't want to be a member of a congregation, but they are passionate, and they're the spiritual but not religious types, and they want to make a difference and feel that they matter, but there's no vehicle in a sense, because that has largely been kind of tossed out the window, baby in bathwater, and maybe even the whole bathroom with it. So we don't have any trappings of ritual and religiosity. And I am struggling to find a way to bring that back. I see a huge civic religion, and even coming up with their own liturgy, certain words that are used now when we talk about protest and being involved in active participation, speaking out against or for our government, that there are certain buzzwords that we use in the same way. If I drop certain Presbyterian words, the congregation knows what they are. I am, though, struggling to blend the two these days. And so I don't really come with a whole plan other than saying, I was fascinated when Ed said this is the topic based off of January 6th, but I'm going to go back to it. My students were largely apathetic, the religious ones. The non-religious ones were up in arms and wanted to say something. And that was fascinating for me as a guy who's trying to figure out how to meet them where they are. Looking forward to continuing the conversation, though, and hoping that Julie and Bryan, you're going to fix it for me, though, and tell me how to do my job.
Thank you. I guess Bryan.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Thanks again for the invitation to be here. It's a delight. Just a reminder, I'm in Holland, Michigan. I grew up in West Michigan as part of the Christian Reformed Church, and now I pastor a UCC church. And if you know anything about those two denominations, you know there's a journey tucked in there somewhere. But happy to talk with you about faith and politics, two topics close to my heart. And, you know, has the division ever been greater between around these two topics in our country? It seems that they're at least at a high in my own lifetime, which of course is, you know, a small piece of our nation's history. But the truth is, I literally cannot have a conversation around religion and politics with some members of my family because we are so far apart from one another that we can't talk about it. And, you know, of course, there's some family dynamics in there that make those relationships a little more complex than others that we'll talk about. And so often, for the sake of the relationships, we just choose to talk about the weather, the grandkids, sports, things like that. But in general, my feeling has always been, shouldn't we be able to talk about the things that are the most important to us? And isn't talking about them how we understand not only those issues better, but understand each other better? And what I've discovered is that there is actually a huge hunger to talk about these things, and not just in a circle of like-minded people. And about a year and a half ago, I was at a brewery near Grand Rapids. This was pre-pandemic and the good old days. And a guy at my table leans over and says, "I'm against the Green New Deal." It'll destroy our economy. We shouldn't give up on traditional sources of energy. And frankly, he says to me, climate change isn't as big of a threat as people are saying it is. I responded, do you think we're obligated to take care of the earth, to care for the environment? And he was quick to say, oh yes, absolutely, but within reason. And so I took a sip of my beer and smiled. We hadn't solved the climate crisis. We hadn't changed each other's minds, but we had found some common ground that we both agreed that we do have a call as human beings, some of us within our framework of faith, to care for the earth, to care for creation. And I asked him about his background, learned a little bit more about his context in rural Newaygo County. And by the end of the conversation, this lifelong Republican said, I like you, and maybe I could even vote for you. At the time, I was running for Congress in Michigan's 2nd District, a district that stretches from Ottawa County all the way up in the Holland area on the south end, all the way up to Ludington and over the edges of Grand Rapids. If you know anything about the electoral map in Michigan, you know that's a very red district. And I was running as a Democrat. And most folks around here scratch their heads at a pastor who would run for office as a Democrat. Those things just didn't compute with most people's understanding of being a Christian, and that's your stance toward politics. And so it was always fun to share my story of growing up as a conservative Republican and now being and having gone through such a journey that when I had the chance to run for office, I'm actually running as a Democrat. But we'll share maybe some of that evolution in that story for another time. But this encounter with this gentleman around, this topic and other topics encapsulates something I discovered over a dozen years ago. And that is that when we sit down with people together and truly listen, that we become more connected, and divisions that we once thought were insurmountable suddenly seem a little less daunting. And this conversation, and many like it, happened at events that we called Pub Democracy, and we held a number of these during the campaign at local breweries around West Michigan, and then once the pandemic hit, over Zoom like this. And then, of course, it was bring your own beverage. And at these gatherings, we'd invite voters from across the district of all political backgrounds. We were very clear. It doesn't matter how you vote or what party you affiliate with or how you think of yourself politically. We want you to come and talk about the issues that matter with other voters. And of course, a bonus was they could ask a candidate for Congress what he thinks as well. And the conversations more often than not were heartfelt, personal, and deep. And I think that's because when we bring people together around the table or around the Zoom screen and encourage an atmosphere of respect, compassion, and curiosity, we discover that we often have more in common than we have apart. And maybe more importantly, we remember that we are fellow human beings who each of us has hopes and dreams, families and friends that we all care about. Well, we'd often draw 40 or 50 people to these events, and it was difficult to have a conversation with that larger group. So we'd break up into a number of smaller groups. And as I would stop by the different groups and listen in on their conversations and join their conversations, it just always brought joy to my heart to hear laughter, see smiles, and discover new friendships being made, even by people who might consider themselves as political opponents. And these conversations were based off of weekly discussion events I've been doing for years called Pub Theology. It's the same idea, except there we focus more on religion, and we invite people from across the religious spectrum to come and gather and talk about issues of meaning, faith, identity, and so on. And my first Pub Theology conversation happened over a dozen years ago. And since then, I've had regular conversations with atheists, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Baha'i, and Hindus and Christians of all sorts in order to learn from each other. And so I had a hunch that this formula would translate into politics, even during a divisive election season, and it seemed to do that. And so what I'm advocating for is a compassionate curiosity of the other as at least a piece of the antidote toward our political divide. But of course, we know this isn't easy. And the truth is that we tend toward the opposite. We tend to, instead of being curious, being sort of smug in having our minds made up. And instead of feeling compassion, we can instead feel disdain, or dare I say, sometimes even hatred toward those we disagree with around issues on politics. And I think, you know, this division in some ways is due to a number of factors, which we're all aware of, right? 24-hour cable news networks, which are increasingly biased in their presentation of facts, the reality of social media, which can reduce someone to, you know, a tweet or a cropped video or even a meme. And these are, of course, easily taken out of proportion. And so when you take this reduction of narrative, lack of relationship, and add in biased sources of information, you have a recipe for the situation that we are in today, a situation where I, as a Democrat, there were times when I didn't feel safe in my home with my family because of threats we received online. You know, people just didn't like hearing the things that I was running on or critiques I would make of the administration at that time or my opponent. And that was, you know, a reality. And I think proposed or real violence, you know, is all the easier when we have no interest, curiosity, or compassion toward the other. And so what I'm proposing takes hard work and intentionality. We'll hear shortly from Julie on some more of this, but I think we have to work to understand each other if we want to have a healthy democracy. So briefly in closing, I'll leave a few tips that might tilt us in a more healthy direction. Number one, get to know someone's story before dismissing them. Ask questions, see what matters to them, get to know who they are. Number two, learn to care about and have compassion about people you disagree with, right? You may sharply disagree with someone on issues around tax policy or response to COVID or immigration, but if we can draw on our moral foundations or our faith traditions to see the image of God or the spark of the divine in each other, we can lean in that compassion. And then I'd say avoid blanket assessments like all Democrats are blank or all Republicans are this, because those blanket assessments are rarely helpful. And then I'd say focus on issues, not on political parties or tribal identities. I think sometimes we hit so many impasses on talking about issues because it becomes about, well, whose team is saying what, and what good will this be for my party if such and such policy is proposed. Instead, let's talk about the issues and seek to find common ground. And then, of course, whenever you can have these conversations in person, the better. But I know that's a challenge in this present moment, but hopefully we're moving there. So with that, I'll end it and hand it over to Julie.
Thank you, Brian. This is a good segue because I think the order went really well tonight. I've been fascinated by all the speakers, and you've had some really wonderful things to think about. My own journey, I was raised Catholic, really started questioning Catholicism in my early 20s and pretty much left it behind. I had to change too many of the words. I felt a little bit more, just didn't feel big enough for where I was. I'm currently part of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Lansing. I am a trainer for the Meta Peace Team, and the Meta Peace Team is not a religious organization. It has a lot of very spiritual people that are part of it, and I feel like, Andrew, there's a lot of people that are very spiritual, but they're focusing their spirituality on the work of nonviolence and making a difference. And definitely the things that we're doing with the Meta Peace Team in domestic peace teams and international peace teams, I've actually written a book to kind of capture what they're doing. It's called The Work of Nonviolence, Stories from the Front Line, basically telling stories of these people on the front lines at domestic peace teams, at KKK rallies, or Flint water crisis, Arab American festivals, national political conventions, gay pride marches, things like that. There are also international peace teams that have served at the US-Mexico border and often at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so the stories that I try to tell, I think that storytelling helps bring it to life, the different skills and tactics of nonviolence, how and why nonviolence works, with an aim to help the reader to understand and develop their own tools and how to react to conflict and de-escalate. And definitely the things that Reverend Bryan just said are all really part of that work. So one of the main important skills that we teach in our trainings is the CLARA method. So it's C-L-A-R-A. Now the C stands for centering, which is basically just taking a deep breath. I call it getting my mojo on. You know, I've just got to kind of connect with my higher sense of self, my higher power, my wisdom source, whatever you want to term it. I need to stay connected with that as I approach a difficult situation. And then like what everyone has said so far is we've got to listen to each other. Listening is active. Listening is leaning in and asking questions and clarifying their answers and making sure that we heard it. And if we're giving them that space to lean in and let them clarify, we're going to really know that we heard. And perhaps they'll really hear us as well, because by our role modeling that, hopefully they will do that for us in return. And when we're listening, I think about it as kind of listening for the A part, which C-L-A. The A part is kind of finding that alignment or kind of affirming what we hear that we have in common. And so I kind of think about that like a Venn diagram. You know, we've got two people, and where do we overlap? Sometimes there's a big overlap and sometimes it's very tiny, but we're trying really hard to listen for the words, for the cues, for that common ground. And that would be the A in the CLARA method. So we often try to teach it that centering, listening, aligning, or affirming. And once we've got that alignment going, then maybe we can respond or bring in some other information or things like that. So that's what the R and the A is. And often we joke that so often when we get in conversations that escalate, we're all in the rah-rah part. We're always responding and adding information, and we have not listened, we have not affirmed, we have not aligned. So there's no connection there. We're just doing the rah-rah dance. And that leaves people feeling not heard. And that helps the anger to escalate, and it helps nothing to get done. And we've all lived that in our various bubbles, in our various tribes that we live in, is that we're all speaking from our own tribe and we're not really listening to what the other tribe is saying. And somehow, even with our news sources, that we continue to stay in our rah-rah mode that serves that echo chamber, rather than really getting a little bit out of our comfort zone and doing the listening that it takes for a different opinion. So I try to illustrate this with a couple of stories, and I want to just share a couple of them with you to illustrate how CLARA works and what it looks like. And back last fall, I'm a family nurse practitioner, and so I see patients in a busy family practice. And one day a woman came into our office and she was really irate about having to wear a mask. And she told the staff about it. She refused to put it on. Somehow she got past the front desk and past my medical assistant and sat in the room without her mask on. So my medical assistant came out and said, got a live one here. She's really angry, not wearing her mask. So I put on my N95 instead of just my little surgical mask. And I had my little plastic gown on and my gloves and my goggles and the whole 9 yards. Went in to see her. So her very body language was just so angry, and anger was just dripping out of her mouth. Which I could plainly see because she wasn't wearing her mask. So she started her tirade and crossed her arms and sat back. And, you know, I work in an office and I work alone now at home. You know that, right? I hate working from home. Work used to be my social life. This is just a stupid virus, and we have to fight viruses every day. So what's the big idea? It's all China's fault. So we all have to quarantine and businesses are shutting down for nothing. It's just killing old people. But 1 million babies are killed every day or every year with abortion, and no one says a word about that. Finally, the governor's rulings were overturned. I hate wearing this mask. So that was her quote. So I sat and listened, hearing very loudly that she was in the non-thinking zone. There was going to be no discussion. There was going to be no, I guess, trying to talk reason. So I let her kind of go on with her tirade. And during her outburst, I was really struggling in my head thinking, Clara method, Clara method. I was trying to kind of quiet down that rah-rah mode. And instead, I just kind of said, listen for the emotion behind what she's saying. And it suddenly occurred to me that she was lonely. So as she kind of got done with her tirade and started to kind of sputter down in her tirade, I dared to say, I said, you know, I know this is hard. I know that this is lonely. And I'm trying to do the best I can do to let you be here by wearing all this PPE. And I want you to be here, but I also want to keep my staff safe, and I want to stay safe for my family and my staff so that all of us can be here. And that we're asking people to wear a mask so that we can keep everybody safe, including her. And so she eventually calmed down. I did say, I'm going to need you to put the mask on so I can do your exam. And she did. And we finally just were able to go on with the visit and leave COVID behind. But honestly, sitting there, I was kind of shook up. It's really hard to be met with so much rage. It was a little bit on the frightening side. So I really had to calm that voice inside of me that just wanted to respond to every one of her angry claims. But I consciously listened and tried to label that emotion behind her tirade, which was her loneliness and her fear. And I didn't fix anything by labeling that. And I have to be okay with that. She eventually left our office without her mask on, but she held her paper in front of her mouth. And I guess that's the best that we can ask for in that situation. So I think that two things I took away with that is that it worked for me to listen for her emotion, but I also had to kind of be okay with not solving anything. I didn't help her see a different way. I just listened. I stayed pretty much in the la-la zone. I did not even attempt rah-rah because that would have escalated her again, and she would have quickly gone right back into her non-thinking zone. So I feel like I'm learning and I'm practicing this every day. I have a time of an example that I feel like I could have done better with the Clara method. It was a recent visit to see my folks before the election. And we started to share some of our political views, which is sometimes very difficult because we come from very different perspectives. And my dad said, people just need to get back to God. But unfortunately, I went right into my rah-rah mode and said, yeah, but Dad, that just doesn't work for some people. So my statement basically just shut down any further discussion. I didn't make a space for them to share why they believe what they believe and why they vote the way they vote. So I could have done more listening, more aligning, and I had hoped at that moment, I hope I get another chance. And gratefully, I did. In January, after the insurrection, I was visiting my folks again, and we started to talk about what happened on the 6th. And again, my dad said, people just need to get back to God. Very same statement. And I was like, I have another opportunity. So this time, I took a deep breath, I centered, paused, and I said, what would that look like, Dad? And then I just stopped talking and let him talk. And what followed was this great back and forth discussion about community, about doing things for people other than ourselves, about being accountable to something other than ourselves. So we were able to find common ground, and it was a much better interchange than the one prior. And it has become a special memory of connection with my dad that will last forever for me. So I was really grateful for that opportunity and that I got another chance. This is really hard work. It's much easier to lash out or to shut down, and often that happens with people from different viewpoints, is we just don't go there. We typically just talk about the weather and about the tigers and, like you said, grandkids or kids or whatever, but nothing that matters. I think religion and politics are the same. There's like they bleed into each other so much you can't dissociate them. They're all part of the same thing, but they're a part of who we are. So why can't we talk about who we are? If we really love each other, we want to try to find a way to listen and to find that common ground and love from that perspective. I think that we're shutting down, and sometimes this kind of disagreement escalates to a fist or a billy club or tear gas or bullets. We're finding that cycle of violence is happening with where we're at in our country. We're finding ourselves in an ideological civil war where we can't even agree on what truth is. And this pits family members against family members and friends against friends. But we're challenged to find a way to relate to one another again, to treat each other humanely again. And we can do this by practicing active listening skills and listening for that common ground that we share with people who are different than ourselves, who believe different or who vote different than ourselves. So I invite all of us to practice Clara by taking that deep breath to slow down our response mode and quiet that rah-rah mode, and instead lean in and ask those questions and actively listen for those responses to try to find that something in common, kind of trying to staying in the la-la mode of listening and aligning or affirming. And once this is established, it gives both parties an opportunity to respond to each other and give a real back and forth dialogue. The goal isn't to change their mind or their heart, but to really listen to them, and perhaps they'll hear us better as well. This skill turns the temperature down and de-escalates before it becomes violent. So religion and politics are two subjects that many people avoid, but nonetheless, we tend to have strong opinions and identities with each of these subjects. As we navigate the divisive nature of this intersection, I hope we can take a deep breath and really listen. And I wish us all wellness with practicing this skill, sometimes falling on our face and skinning our nose, but getting back up and trying it again. Because when it comes to our family and our friends, this is what love looks like. Amen. So questions, comments?
And folks, if anyone's more comfortable, you can post in the chat too, and I can just make sure that those questions get read out loud, whatever you're most comfortable with.
I would like to say thank you all. This has been really educational for me, especially you, Julie. I'm struggling now with my brother who won't talk to me because I won't affirm Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. After 30 years in the church, it was a long road to get me out of the church, and I'm not there anymore. But he won't talk to me unless I can make that affirmation. And I'm stuck. I love my brother, but I'm stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Comments?
Well, I don't think you're alone. I feel it with members in my own family, and the silence is hard, and it's also a kind of box against what I think Jesus taught. And I think that a lot of the great teachers in our history have taught that kind of love. And so in some ways, that might be the common ground, is your love for him and your assumed love that he has for you. And that if we can go and stay there without the trappings of politics, without the trappings of labels, without the trappings of different identities, that the love is what brings you together, that makes you want to show up and take these risks in the first place. And that's what you're asking of him to do as well, is to love you and take that risk, and let his love for you be primary over that identity kind of thing.
Yes, I'm going to have to go back there. You're absolutely right. When we stay away from the politics, we're kind of okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
What I try to do with my family is try to not use names and try to not use political party names. I try to tell stories and try to talk about, much like what Reverend Bryan said, talk about the issues, and that can we find common ground on the importance of the issues, not on the politics behind.
Yeah, it's so difficult to find common ground when you can't even find a common source of truth.
Amen. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that has made the divisiveness, the chasm between much deeper and much wider. And it's frankly, I think, to the detriment of our nation as a whole.
Yeah.
If I could weigh in here just a sec, I'm so appreciating all that's been said, and would particularly just Julie's comment about Jesus, would really want to embrace that, his capacity to listen, incredible pastoral sensitivity in the midst of a crowd to pick up needs, and but also conflicts and suspicions and entrapments. He's aware of those, and to respond in a very loving way, which is, I think, foundational of his nonviolence. But also to march into Jerusalem and go to the temple and do very dramatic confrontational actions as a way of speaking, and for the very forms of love that he represented and embodied as such a threat to systems built on the power of death. He was crucified. And I think there's, that needs to be part of, it's so crucial in understanding nonviolence, that it's a positive, what Gandhi called truth force, satyagraha, but there's also a no to it. And we live in a culture of extreme violence, really rooted on the power of death. That to say no to it is to put ourselves in a position of risk and opposition. I'll just tell one, if I may tell one quick story without going on too long. Years ago in the 70s, a group of us walked.
By a man who said he was a journalist.
I'm sorry, what?
Please continue. Please continue.
Years ago, in the 70s, a group of us walked a couple hundred miles from Clam Lake, Wisconsin, to the Air Force Base in the Upper Peninsula in Marquette. The Navy was planned to build a trigger finger for Trident submarines, a grid antenna that could penetrate seawater with extra low frequency waves. And we started it in Clam Lake, Wisconsin, and walked the length of the Upper Peninsula. The direct action was at the end at the SAC base, where the rest of the antenna was to be built. But in Clam Lake, where we began at the test facility, our presence had been noised on the radio, and as we gathered for kind of a ceremony to begin, a whole bunch of folks showed up who'd been stirred up against us and came out in opposition, and kind of in the manner of what Julie and Bryan and Andrew are all talking about, we formed a circle. We said, let's talk. And exactly as you're talking, it turned out that they said, we're concerned about the future of our children. And we said, that's what we're concerned about, is the future of our children, and what a world of nuclear weapons looks like, and where that leads, especially first strike ones like the Trident submarine. And I think I know they were taken back suddenly to be in a circle in conversation. I know the guy on the radio show who stirred them up, envisioning they'd, drive us out of town, was disappointed. But I think the reality of nonviolence needs to hold what seems like a paradox, this no and this resistance to death, with openness and love, which looks for the common ground we're talking about.
That's well said, Bill. Thank you.
Seth, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, thanks very much for the conversation tonight. I was particularly interested in 2 points. One was from Andrew, and he was talking about sort of apathy and sort of, I guess, apathy in college, but I think this stems a lot farther than just college, and apathy towards politics, towards like addressing issues of justice, those types of things. And I guess so. I'm just very curious about that. That made me think about what the drivers of apathy are. Things like distrust, or distrust in like government or in politicians or in voting processes, those types of things, and how we kind of overcome that through building trust. I know that's the opposite of that, but I mean, I think the conversation tonight is about building relationships. So I think that trust comes in that, but I don't know, maybe that's sort of at the center is trust. Also very interested in Bryan's point. You mentioned, running as a sort of a Democratic pastor, and how people can kind of see that shocking. I've been thinking a lot about that question lately as well. And it's just, I mean, the things that, at least in the Christian tradition, what Jesus did could be considered very radically progressive towards what he's doing. So anyway, I don't know if those are questions, but any two kind of thoughts that I'm thinking about.
Thanks, Seth. I'll just jump in real quick on that one. Yeah, what got me is last summer in particular. So as I'm watching the Black Lives Matter protests around the country, I am seeing some who are active. And again, I know I am lumping people together, but just my anecdotal experience, I was shocked. It was not my students who are the faith leaders on campus. They were leaders in other places, but they definitely wanted to tell me about what they're doing. But it wasn't that I saw the opposite of activism was some type of counter protest, or that they were these alt-right groups. It was simply apathy and indifference, and almost to the point of general boredom. Like well, it's nice, but I'm still worried about getting to grad school, or I'm just doing other things, or even to the surprising ones for me, where someone want to talk, like a student would want to meet one-on-one, like Zoom all summer, and they chat. I'm like, oh yeah, what do you think about what's going on in the news? And I'm like, I don't really know what you're talking about. I thought at once they were kind of like punking me, but it was legit. And I see plenty of well-meaning students who seem to be compassionate to their individual neighbors right next door to them that they see, or their roommate. But it's a tough one for me to help all of them understand that there is a communal aspect that extends beyond the borders of Gratiot County. That's my comment, just 2 cents on that one.
I think I see some of that too, Andrew, and then I see students who I think are more outliers, who are very active and engaged, but I think that it takes some cultivation and some modeling by those that they're in community with, for sure, to sort of tap into their latent activist energies. But yeah, I agree 100%, Seth. To me, it makes perfect sense to be a Democrat and a Christian, and a lot of my own spiritual journey went along with my political journey in just really honing in on the Gospels and, the words and actions of Jesus. And, I began to think, what have I been doing, voting Republican all these years? The more I kind of tuned into who I saw Jesus being and embodying, always making space for the other, and challenging the powers that be, as Bill said, walking into the temple and being willing to, make a public demonstration, so to me, it makes perfect sense, but also my context in West Michigan is the majority of folks here vote Republican, and it is a highly religious community in the conservative sense. So but it always invited a conversation, which I was happy to share the story, because when people heard I grew up, a kid of Dutch immigrants in the Christian Reformed Church who went to Calvin Seminary, they just assumed, oh, well, how come you're not a Republican? And it was fun to share my story. And I remember WZZM 13 did a story on this Christian pastor is running for Congress. And then they said, ... as a Democrat. And when they posted that to Facebook, the comment section blew up, and people, without bothering to read the interview or the story, lobbed all these things about how can a Christian be a Democrat. And so it just was a reminder to me, because I tend to, now that I'm in the UCC and in more democratic and progressive circles, sometimes forget where I am, and things like that are a reminder, that we are very divided, and we can take the same religious figure and wind up in totally different places. But I think applying some of Julie's wisdom and some of the things others have said, I think there is an ability to recover some common ground, to take that deep breath, take a step back and say, what are the things we long for in the world? And maybe we have different ideas about how we get there, but there might be some common desires underneath. And let's start with those.
Can I jump in one more time then, Seth? And thank you, Brian, and thanks for demonstrating it. Yeah, you can do it as a Dem. It's not a problem. This seems like a friendly crowd to say it in too. My last congregation, Gretchen Whitmer was a very active member of my congregation, and Virg Bernero, who ran for governor before that, was also an active member. And anytime I would tell, usually my Christian clergy friends, they thought, well, it's a good thing you're making a difference and really trying to help them see the error of their ways. It was always kind of fun to see, like, oh, you really think that's where we're at? And then to also hear the cynicism coming from my colleagues on the right, who are like, well, they're just there for show. I'm like, I don't think so, because she was sitting in the back and snuck in and left before anyone noticed. I mean, it wasn't there was already these assumptions about what even politicians who espouse to be Christian do and how they take advantage of the church from both sides of it, that were fascinated to watch it play out in Lansing, because we'd have folks come in and out of this congregation that I don't know. I was always blown away. I assumed that they wanted something, but God love them. Some of them just showed up to worship, which is kind of cool. Like I always shocked and amazed, and yet it was so far from the norm, at least in people's minds, it seemed like.
I have a question, Andrew. You and I think there's a lot of overlap in the work that we do with students. For those on the call, I also work at Alma College, and I see an anxiety in students, in a sense of that comes from like a sense of emptiness. I think I was really struck by when you're talking about kind of the death of institutions that for decades, just young people, developing people have joined, that where they naturally meet. Okay, the people in my neighborhood or the people that have joined these clubs, and young people don't do that anymore. And I wonder about, what are your experiences like, gently pushing some of those students on the ways that they find meaning in their lives. Okay, like what are you talk about not being a part of any groups, and that is something that you struggle with. So how do you in your work kind of maybe get students kind of thinking about that in a way?
Yeah, I've been more of a matchmaker lately, which feels like a weird part of my job, but they're willing to do the one-on-one relationship work at times. But even getting to see that, I love talking to them, but they have peers and they have faculty and they have staff who also are asking questions about how the world works and what's fair and what's not, and what does justice look like. And, do they talk about that, drunk on a Friday night? I mean, do they have any forum for it? Like, I would embrace that happily, and trying right now to encourage them to it's almost like play dates like I do with my little kids, like calling up the other parents and saying, so now it's calling another professor. I'm like, I've got John and you've got Sarah, and they both seem to want to talk about this stuff. Maybe you should talk about someone who's the same age as them, which is not the same thing as getting them to join groups. I find, again, I'm gonna go back to the transactional. I love Elma, I really do, but we are no different than any other undergraduate institution where we make even these clubs that they're part of. They are definitely transactional for a CV and for an application, that they need to say that they were the treasurer of this service club, or they were in this fraternity, but they were also the communications director in it. And there's a lack of joy in being part of the community, at least I'm finding. I rarely see a club that seems to exist to simply be a meeting place or a community building. I struggle with that. And maybe take advice from this. It seems like you all are showing up not because you need this on your CV, unless this is something like we have to stamp it after you attend this meeting tonight. But I'm amazed to watch grown-ups do this and don't know how to teach that to students. Like, do something that's going to make you feel built up or edified in any way. I don't care if it's in the church or not. I don't know, but you, David, do you do anything different though? Because I'd take advice here.
Well, it's, because of the role I play, all our work's confidential. And so to kind of connect students to one another would be to break that confidentiality. So it's almost like my work has to end leading them to the water. It's up to them to kind of take the initiative and to take that next step. I think I have the right questions sometimes, kind of what matters to you when you look at the ways you're spending time throughout the day. Why are you committing that time in that way? How does that kind of align with your values? And I think that there are times where that work is very, very valuable, but I think there's a point where you have to, some students aren't there yet. And just, that's kind of the reality of the work that I do with mental health and whatnot. But yeah, there's some limitations in what I do that's just natural to the work, but thank you, Andrew, I appreciate it.
Well, keep leading them to the water. I'll leave some kayaks strategically placed with like some food and pizzas, and maybe they'll hang out and stay by the shore for a little while together.
I'd like to share a little bit. Two things in my life. I grew up in a very right-wing family, and at some point in my life, I became very progressive, and I thought I saw the light. And so I'm going around trying to convince everybody I'm right and they're wrong. And just recently, I had a conversation with my brother, one of my brothers who I'm very close to. And he said, Norb, you keep telling me I'm wrong. And it just hit me between the eyes. It was so blunt and yet so truthful. I thought he was the one that was telling me I was wrong. And I'm the one that was doing it to him. Which leads me to my second point, is that just as strong as I am in my position, those who I disagree with are just as strong in theirs. And so I really appreciate all of you, what you're saying, and especially Julie, listen. And I was known as a listener in some groups. And I thought, I'm sure missing the point with my brother. And so I'm really working on that.
There's a question for Julie in the chat.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah.
First, I want to tell Norb, thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right. And that Venn diagram I was telling you about, sometimes the only thing that overlaps is our passion. I feel passionate, you feel passionate. We disagree on that, but we do have passion. So sometimes to just talk about, I hear that is just so important to you. Right. And to honor that is something important to them. And I may not agree with you. I feel differently, but I also feel as passionate, and hopefully that we can use this passion for good and for finding that common ground, and that yeah. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So I think the question in the I saw it come up, and it looked like, how do you believe that a Meta Peace team could have changed things on January 6th? I got that question at a different presentation that I did, and my answer was it wouldn't have changed anything on January 6th. But on the 5th and the 4th and the 1st and the decades before that, it could change a lot. And so I think that by the time we get to what we saw on the 6th, a peace team wouldn't have made any difference. People wearing a yellow vest saying peace team and using the Clara method and interpositioning and all kinds of tactics that we use to de-escalate violence. It was way out of hand. But the process of allowing people to get to that point, to have people who care and love these people, to talk to them and to listen to them and to find and to use those strategies for the decades or years or months before that may have made a difference in how many people showed up. And I think that's what we're called right now, because there are people still percolating that kind of degree of anger and vitriol. How do we listen to them and give them a voice? How do we hear their pain? How do we hear their dissatisfaction with the way things are and empower them to use their energy for the force of good rather than for tearing down the house in the literal sense? I think that's the challenge before us right now.
Can I weigh in on that? A group of us in the fall, a group of us in the fall, in anticipation of a coup, formed a community and affinity group here in Detroit, which included members of the Meta Peace team. We were prepared to act with a wide network of people around the country in the wake of what occurred on January 6th. If that had been a successful coup, there was a wide network of community-based folks committed to nonviolence who would have acted. As the election election day approached, we kind of, in anticipation, and we didn't know in Detroit whether there would be open carry intimidation at polling places in Detroit. There was every reason to expect there might be. And so using Clara preparation, we all went through some nonviolence training again together with Meta Peace Team folks. And on election day, we divided up into pairs and covered all of the polls moving around the city, prepared to do any de-escalation that we were able to do. And in that case, it turned out in Detroit proper not to be necessary, though there were some of our teams that ended up going both to the north and downriver to places which were hot spots. But again, this combination of being prepared to act in resistance to a coup, which would have been crucial, I think, for a nonviolent uprising in the wake of January 6th, but also to be on the front end doing the kind of de-escalation work Julie's talking about. I was going to say one more thing, and this is just out of the Detroit context. The movement for Black Lives has been so amazing in terms of being young people. You know, it's a young people's led movement. I get treated periodically like a movement elder, which I am. I mean, I have to swallow hard to admit it, but I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is phenomenal, and it's totally run by young people who sometimes I think they're inventing something from scratch when they're actually stepping into a moving stream. And there's lots of room for conversation on that score. But I just think it's been an amazing young movement.
Bobby, did you have something?
Well, I kind of wanted to get back to Andrew and you, David. I'm curious I guess I'm wondering how much the pandemic has to do with your students feeling lost or uninvolved, or this has been hard for everyone, and I don't see how it should not be hard for the students. So, or is this a pandemic of their own over the last 3 years? I don't know.
Again, anecdotally, David, I don't know if you've seen, I mean, it's been a major uptick for me for one-on-ones. I mean, I'm more like a triage. Yeah, I'm definitely not a therapist. I am there to pick up the slack when you have it. It's been an awful lot of people sending them over to me because you all, David, are overworked. But I think it's the pandemic hasn't helped. But right now, at the end of they're tired. They're always tired this time of year. But right now, I have students who are I mean, they might as well be like hanging out with Hemingway in Paris. It feels like they're like, doesn't matter. I don't need to show up to anything, do I? The world's gonna end. And it was funny in October. In April, it's feeling way too close to home because they should be looking at the other side, thinking it does matter. And now there's something I can be hopeful for. And there's a lot of disaffected students right now. But there's also for faculty. I'm watching my faculty college too. I'm teaching right now, and I'm phoning it in. It feels like my classes. I love my students a lot, but if I have to look at another Zoom screen to teach a class, I'll go crazy. That's not why I'm the chaplain, and that's not why I teach homiletics. It's just it's tough. Everyone's feeling it. That was a snarky answer. I'm sorry. I wish I had something better for you in that one.
No, after Zoom fatigue, Andrew, we feel guilty and what we've done.
Oh, no. And not at all. I am getting yelled at by my family to go upstairs and eat. They're waiting on dinner for me. I apologize and told them 8 instead of 8:30. So I'm going to have to jet in a minute. I got kids that are waiting for me.
Thank you. And your answer did not sound snarky to me. It sounded real.
Thank you.
Can I weigh in here just a little bit? I have a saying that I kind of live by. It sort of like holds me. It's like a post that I hold on to in the stormy days of life. And I think this might apply right now. But years ago, I think it was in 1999, I heard a little boy named Nkosi Johnson, a 10-year-old South African child who spoke at the World AIDS Conference. And he had AIDS. He was dying of it, having received it from birth. And he said at this world stage, I mean, he's this little tiny black face standing on this huge stage. And he said, do all you can with what you have in the place you are with the time you have. And in some ways, even as the world may feel like it's ending, or as we know it, or we have this huge chasm of division and anger in our society, I think that one thing about COVID is it's made us kind of pull in and kind of figure out what's important to us. And I think we've talked about a lot of those things tonight. But in some ways, that might be the answer as we go towards some of these very difficult times, is what's important and what can I do with what I have in the place I am with the time I have. That isn't big. Sometimes it's very small, but we've got to kind of focus our energies there rather than feeling stymied by inactivity.
I think there's so many questions we could all ask, but I think we have. I keep thinking of Andrew's meal, but not just that. I think all this raises so many issues. I hope maybe we could come back to this. I don't know, and I wish we were doing this in person, but we really. I have questions, but they take us forever. I think we're going to record this. You can watch it, and I think you all probably have some of our contact information, mine or someone else's, that you heard about this. We'd really urge you to start. Maybe we could exchange ideas of how to follow up, because we obviously have a lot more we'd like to talk about. And we really welcome that, and ideas of what we could do after this to answer questions that have been raised and questions that you didn't get to answer. So I guess, am I ending it by saying that? But thank you very much. I especially want to thank our 4 panelists, you know, Bill and Andrew and Brian and Julie. You've been great. You're thoughtful. You make us want to know you more, even when we do know you a little. And thank everyone for the good questions and for the participation.
As Ed said, folks, the forum will be recorded. There will be a little lag. I'm going to get it up on YouTube probably, hopefully by the end of the week, although that is the promise I made last month, but I'm going to stick to it this month. That will go out. If you're on our Gratiot Dems email list, you'll get it that way. If you are not, and you'd like the link, you can contact Ed or myself if you have my contact information and get it that way. So thank you all for being here.
Yes,
Thank you, everybody.
really.
Appreciate being able to join.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.